Millions of water surge death to spin, and all kinds of monsters in the West are cluttered, and they are crazily involuntary on the road of political correctness. Why is the United States obsessed with politically correct chanting, so path-dependent and rigid? How to deal with completely different new competitors and competitive situations. Death spin. The ant mill is a unique phenomenon that occurs in army ants. Army ants usually form a large team. The first army ant in the team secretes trail pheromone, while the army ants use their sense of smell to follow. When the system works well, it can get food back to base faster. But when the leading army ants lose their direction and become confused, the army ants will still blindly follow these pheromones, eventually forming a never-ending cycle. If the cycle is not broken for some reason, the army ants will not be able to escape this death vortex, and continue to circle in the vortex until he dies from exhaustion. As below this video. The current Western political circle's dependence on the path is so deep-rooted that it has fallen into this kind of death spiral. Clinging to the rules, everything is according to the ancestral system, and unable to extricate itself from the shackles of thought, the whole society seems to have lost its motivation to move forward, and has entered a huge in situ involution, and the center of rotation is the political correctness under the banner of progressive. This politically correct narrative has penetrated into every aspect of society, from politics to society, from individuals to communities, and is all-encompassing. And not only inwardly, but also inwardly, political correctness has become a game of adding weight to each other. You support gay marriage, then I support transgender men in women's restrooms. You support the legalization of drugs, then I will open an official drug den. If you support the protection of refugees, then I will directly send money to refugees. If you support the fight against police oppression of black people, I will support defund the police to disband the police department. Anyway, comparing each other who is more advanced and who is more woke, so that even common sense can be ignored. Remember the $0 shopping that has been particularly popular in the United States recently? Refer to the new festival after Black Friday in the previous article, Golden Week for buying with $0. Recently, a group of robbers were caught, and all of them were released on bail under the banner of political correctness. The political correctness of the United States has fallen into an involution like an ant's death spin. In an atmosphere where you are crazy and I am crazier than you, the people involved are unconscious. Under the crazy involution, all walks of life began to go crazy, especially the industries with higher white left content. Inexplicable victory. How did this wonderful political correctness come into being? The main source is the inexplicable victory of the West in the Cold War. In the 1980s, the entire Western public opinion circle was very desperate. For the first time in history, the Western world found itself unable to overwhelm their opponents by force. Because of nuclear weapons, they don't even have the option of military adventures. The United States has just suffered a defeat in Vietnam, and the situation is bleak. After all, even the Viet Cong guerrillas couldn't beat it. How to face the torrent of steel from Soviet Russia. Until 1985, it seemed that the Soviet Union still had the upper hand in the arena between the United States and the Soviet Union for hegemony. Renowned historian Adam Ulam later noted, "What we tend to forget is that in 1985 the Soviet Union was more secure in power and clearer in policy than the major powers of the world." I can't beat the old man, and I don't even have the courage to make two gestures, so I can only hype the nuclear winter, scaring the Russians that once the war starts, they will burn everything together. Don't follow Khrushchev's throwing boots. The doomsday clock was created by the University of Chicago, and the concept of nuclear winter was also created by the Americans, proposed by the TAPS Group in 1983, Richard Turco, Brian Thune, Thomas Ackerman, James Pollock and Carl Sagan are the initials of the five scientists. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, thinks their calculation model is a mess. Sagan said, "We are saving mankind, you murderous devil, shut up." On the other side, chanting began, which is what we call peaceful evolution. Just think about how overflowing the military virtues of the Yangtze clan have been. Since the 17th century, they have traversed the world, destroying those who deserve it, and conquering those who are attacked. If it wasn't for Tai Pao, who couldn't handle it, and was suffocated, how could he pull the mouth cannon out? It's Shining City on the Hill again. It's rock music, it's Coca-Cola, and it's chanting sutras with flowers. 5 metal bands AC/DC, Metallica, the Black Crowes, Pantera, EST came to Red Square to participate in the Moscow Rock Music Festival. It is said that there were more than 1 million people present at the time. In the end, the crazy young people fought with more than 10,000 Soviet troops maintaining order. It is said that 32 people were trampled to death and more than 400 were seriously injured. It is indeed magical to listen to rock and roll amidst the roar of Me-24. Reagan is called the greatest communicator by Americans, the strongest master of chanting in history. In fact, the public opinion circles in the United Kingdom and the United States did not expect any effect from chanting scriptures. American political scientists with a profound background in realism never believe that talking can be more effective than iron cannons. More than half of the sutras are actually read for domestic audiences. Yes, it is equivalent to whistling at night to embolden yourself. Then within a few years, the Soviet Union collapsed inexplicably. The Soviet Union collapsed so quickly that even NATO commanders did not make emergency plans. The Soviet Union's huge nuclear arsenal was not in trouble. It is a blessing for mankind. Even George Kennan, the greatest geopolitical guru in modern times, the national teacher among the national teachers, and one of the architects of the U.S. national strategy in the Cold War, George Kennan said, "Looking at the entire history of modern international affairs, there is nothing more important than the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. The sudden complete disintegration and disappearance are more strange, surprising and incomprehensible events." The father of the Cold War, George Kennan, whose famous long telegram kicked off the Cold War. Faced with the inexplicable victory, the Western countries were very surprised. It seems difficult to say what role the West played in the collapse of Soviet Russia, other than the old-fashioned talk about the problems of the Soviet Union itself. If the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1970s or 1960s, the United States can confidently say that its strategy buried its opponents. But in the 1980s, the United States was clearly on the defensive, so why did it suddenly win? The victory of the Cold War was so sudden that the United States didn't even have the opportunity to review it carefully. After much deliberation, except for the exaggerated Star Wars plan, the Americans' own intelligence also shows that the Soviet Union did not actually take the bait, it was just chanting. Ever since, the matter of chanting scriptures has been praised to the altar. After all, such a powerful Soviet Russia has been overwhelmed by chanting scriptures. What else can't be successful by chanting scriptures? Path dependency. Just 20 years after the victory of the Cold War, the United States, which was still immersed in the joy of victory in the Cold War, suddenly discovered that a new opponent had emerged in the East. And unlike Soviet Russia, the industrial output and economic strength of this new rival seems to be about to surpass that of the United States. At the peak of Soviet Russia, its economic strength was less than 60% of that of the United States. What plan will it make? The United States, which didn't understand why it was able to suddenly defeat Soviet Russia, could only move out the old method of chanting scriptures during the Cold War and try again. It's like a Mongolian doctor. The last time he got the prescription messily, he actually cured the disease. Next time he meets a similar patient, he can only take the medicine again according to the last prescription. As for how the disease is cured, even if the disease is it's not the same disease, completely ignored. Therefore, the current general policy of the United States towards China has returned to the old path of chanting scriptures. I hope that the sound of saying no boiled persimmon oil will be as loud as the Red Square Rock Festival, and that a country in the East will naturally implode like its northern neighbor. Under this general policy, many unimaginable operations have been produced. For example, in the face of a certain country's pressing force in the South China Sea, instead of rushing to increase the budget to build an aircraft carrier and open a new base, instead of learning from Guyan Liu, a master of chanting, to hold a turtle-killing conference, oh no, avoid cooking the conference. It is hoped that the supersonic missiles on the other side can be offset by the salvo of gunfire. Another example is that a certain country went to Laos to build a high-speed rail, and extend access to Southeast Asia. The United States has no countermeasures. It can only send a vote of Buddhist scripture masters to repeatedly talk about the high-speed rail construction and debts. This is not good. 50 years ago, the violent Midi would have turned the tables. Laos is the country with the most bombs per capita in the world. During the Vietnam War, the United States dropped 270 million bombs in Laos because it suspected that North Vietnam was sending supplies through Laos, killing and injuring 1 million people, and left about 80 million unexploded bomb. The first thing the China-Laos Railway did was to spend 5 months digging out the unexploded bombs along the line and disposing of them. In just half a century, carpet bombing has turned into carpet chanting, which is really embarrassing. Although I have been chanting scriptures to the enemy countries in East Asia for 20 years, except for chanting a bunch of Zhangjiadun and shouting every day that the collapse of XX is in front of me, it is useless at all. But even so, American think tanks still can't get rid of path dependence and continue to shout, increase the dose of chanting. Million water workers. Anyone with a discerning eye can see that chanting scriptures is of no use to the enemy countries in East Asia. Why hasn't the always alert American political elite changed course? In fact, there is no need for any political elites. Even passers-by like Trump can see that relying on peaceful evolution and reciting no cooking persimmon oil has no effect at all except wasting a lot of money. So after he came to power, he abolished the funding for chanting. Do you feel that when Trump is fighting a trade war on stage, the public opinion environment is more positive? It can only be said that the world is prosperous, all for profit, dog food once withdrawn, immediate results, concentrate on head-to-head economic warfare and technological warfare. In fact, it is really good. If Biden continues to increase his weight, it will definitely make this East Asian challenger more uncomfortable for a while. However, not long after Biden took over, he returned to the old way of chanting scriptures, and the economic war has been eased in an all-round way. See the previous article, The Success of the Zurich Peace Talks, A New Beginning for Sino-US Relations. Obviously Chuan Huang's strategy of defeating the enemy has been proven to be effective, but Biden has to succumb to some short-term factors, die down, and continue to return to the road of chanting scriptures that has been repeatedly proved useless. The reason is very simple: millions of water workers have to do it because of their food and clothing. Here is an old story about the Ming Dynasty. CAO workers, also known as Jun, are the various supervising yamen and the army and laborers who transport and escort grain on the Beijing-Hangzhou Grand Canal. The emperor of the Ming Dynasty guarded the border, but the grain production in Beijing and Hebei could not support the huge center of the empire, so grain could only be transported from the south to the north. At that time, there were two ways. One way was to rely on the Beijing-Hangzhou Grand Canal and human water transportation, and the other way was to rely on sea transportation to Tianjin and then to Beijing. Later, for various reasons, Zhu De finally chose the method of water transportation, which gave birth to a huge water labor group, which is said to have more than 1 million people at its peak. The governor of water transport had a very high status. Of the 99 officials who had served as the governor of water transport in the Ming Dynasty, more than 30 of them later joined the cabinet to pay homage to the prime minister. Millions of water workers have formed a huge community of interests. The empire continued to bloat, the cost of the imperial capital continued to expand, and the laborious and inefficient water transportation gradually became unable to support it. Some people of insight proposed to reopen shipping. In 1487, Qiu Jun, the minister of the Ministry of Rights, proposed to reopen sea transportation. He explained the advantages of sea transportation in detail. Although sea transportation is a danger of drowning, each sea boat can carry more than 1,000 stones of grain, which is 3 times that of a river boat. Labor, reputation of superficial fees, orderly observance. As soon as the proposal came out, it was immediately strongly opposed by the water transport interest community, who bluntly said that the law of the ancestors cannot be changed. After all, millions of water workers depend on food and clothing, so after they are transported by sea, do they drink the northwest wind? Do you still remember how many governors of water transport entered the cabinet to pay homage to their prime ministers? These people twisted into a super strong rope, and whoever dared to carry out sea transportation would put a Chinese watch on him. In this way, although sea transportation saves labor and money, until the Ming Dynasty fell, it was not possible to reopen sea transportation on a large scale. The United States is also a similar situation. After chanting scriptures for decades, how many people eat sutras? All kinds of think tanks, media, academic institutions, and university research institutes, there are more than 1 million people who support their families by reciting scriptures. Moreover, these people are surrounded by the top figures in American politics, and they have written books and talked about the importance of chanting and the power of chanting scriptures, formed a huge echo chamber. In this echo chamber, classics debate is the ultimate elegance, and political correctness is a red line that must never be crossed. Who dares to say that chanting sutras has no effect, and criticize them with words and pens? At the beginning, Chuan Huang just didn't mix with these people. It's not that Chuan Huang saw through them as useless, It was that Chuan Huang just didn't like sour nerds, and Chuan Huang's strategy towards China mainly came from those people who were not in line with the mainstream academic circles, especially a group of Chinese two devils. That's why it's quite effective. Put on him all kinds of hats, the entire media, internet, and academia are twisted together, and I can't wait to learn from the governors of water transport and put the Sichuan emperor on the Huabia. Biden is a political veteran who has been immersed in Washington for 40 years. How could he not know the great power of the chanting group? Of course, sprinkle the dog food again, polish the horn, and return to the old way of chanting. As for whether chanting is useful, no one cares so much. The G2 hegemony is a protracted battle, and there is no such thing as a winner. It is better to think about how to pass the midterm elections a year later. Aftertaste. The late British Sir Glove studied many empires in history and believed that the average lifespan of an empire was about 250 years. The average lifespan of a great empire is only 250 years, and it is almost impossible to exceed 300 years. This is also true in Chinese history. I think that the curse that prevented the empire from exceeding 300 years probably also came from the hard-won millions of water workers and path dependents.